Thanks, everyone. I am happy to be here. And today I'm going to share with you the kind of stuff that I'm doing out in the field, the real world applications with the biochar we make at Qualterra. And I want to bring us back to why we really care about this and why the biochar push in agriculture is really coming around. And one of those reasons is the big difference in input and what is now, well, from the 1930s up to now, the amount of inputs that farmers are putting into the soils are increasing exponentially. And in the beginning, that was fantastic. We started putting in fertilizers and getting bigger crops, and now we are required to be putting all of these other things in and still not getting a big profit margin. So we're going back to our roots to try to figure out how we can make this gap a little bit smaller and bring it back to where we were in the 1930s and 40s. And the other reason we're looking at this is environmental health, right? We all know that agriculture produces a lot of greenhouse gases. In the United States alone, agriculture is estimated to produce 10.5% of our greenhouse gases, and that's directly from turning the soil, from livestock, and flipping our soil over from forests to farms. There's a lot of ways to mitigate that, which is, again, why we're looking at biochar. But if you start taking into account the fuel that we're using to be delivering all of these inputs into our fields, now we're looking at 35% of our annual greenhouse gas emissions, which is quite a bit. And that number could keep increasing if you start really getting into post-harvest biology. So today I'm really going to be mostly referring to soil carbon. We're losing it as we're turning our crops over, and biochar, of course, is a big component for soil carbon storage. We all know what biochar can do. That's why we're here, right? And there's dozens and dozens and dozens of peer-reviewed papers that tell us that soil structure will improve, we can reduce nitrate emissions, increase nutrient uptake, and reduce water evaporation, which again is very important. And of course, enhancing microbial activity, which helps kind of wrap all of these things together to improve our soil health. And we want to, of course, increase our long-term carbon storage. So one of the things that is great about biochar, and I want to bring this back to and remind everyone that it's the structure of carbon that is making this such an amazing component to be putting back into our soils, because the bonding capacity of carbon makes it perfect for life. We're all carbon-based, right? And then, of course, we get these amazing allotropes of mineral carbon, and the electrical conductance and the energy storage and the structure stability of these carbon structures is what's doing the power for us. And when we're getting biochar from, plant sources especially, I want to just point out, like, lignin is a beautiful carbon structure with tons of other molecules in it, and it's just wrapped up tightly, and it makes these cell wall structures. And here we have pictures of xylem, and these structures are carried over when we start making our biocarbon biochar. And of course, then we get different looking biochars. Here's some walnut shell, here's wheat, wood, and rice. And all these different carbon structures are going to behave a little bit differently in different soils, and they're going to be better or worse for certain soils. And we know that, right? And then, of course, on top of that, we get into pyrolysis conditions. The hotter the pyrolysis conditions or gasification conditions, then we start removing any additional molecules that we don't want leaching into our soils. And then, of course, timing of application. I always try to get people to do it in the fall, but in our area, people are pretty sick of farming by October, so so it ends up being a spring application a lot. But these are all things that, of course, we take into consideration when we set up our trials. And the goals of our trials: turn agricultural waste streams into stable carbon, reduce greenhouse gas impacts of modern agriculture, improve soil health, decrease unsustainable inputs, and of course, the most important right now is one of the reasons we're all here, instill economic confidence that biochar can improve soil health, crop production, and a return on investment. So out in Washington State, where I live, wheat straw is abundant. So that is the majority of what we make at Qualterra. It's not the only kind of biochar we make. Here's an example of our vineyard biochar, and they're very different. You can see the particle size differences, and the pH is a little different. The carbon is about the same. But when we're talking about wheat straw, we have low trace metals and minerals, and then in vineyard trimmings, high trace metals and minerals preserved from years and years of cultivating in vineyards and dropping pesticides and whatever else they've been dropping on that soil since the 1930s. So here's just a summary of a lot of our trials, and there's always PowerPoint errors and moving stuff around. But we have over 30 field trials and over 15 crops across 60 plus acres, 5 states. We have a little one going in Idaho right now. But one of our big ones, a lot of our big ones that we have in Washington State are fruit tree, and I'm gonna get into some data on some fruit tree studies that we've done. And we have another big one down here in Louisiana with Tabasco with their peppers, and we're seeing really, really good results. And in Louisiana, they've got heavy silt soil. They have salt problems. Up in Washington State, we're dealing with really heavy clay soil and loam for the most part. And one of the reasons that the research we're doing that I find it successful is that I'm picking a specific amount of things to measure, and I'm doing it over and over again with different crops. So with trees, I get caliper, height, and leaf nutrients over the course of the season, and I do it over and over in one growing season, and I go back year after year so that we can get data for long term. And of course, potted plants in our research greenhouse up in Cheney, Washington, outside Spokane. We're looking at canopy size, density, flowering time, and then we check our fruit quality for post-harvest, because one thing that we do know is that biochar is very good at transferring nutrients and pulling up water, but sometimes that doesn't translate into better fruit. That can be a problem. So these are things that we're looking into. And foliage, I mean, biochar almost always increases foliage. So if you're growing lettuce, that's usually pretty good. And we do outsourced soil testing for health and nutrients. And then, of course, most of our field trials go for multiple years. And I just want to point out Lexi, my assistant, who is invaluable for getting caliper low on the ground and data analysis, let's be real. And then Jed, he helps water the greenhouse and helps measure things. And now we have a new guy, Timon James, that helps us with the greenhouse. And of course, with different crops, as we all have been discussing in this room, different application methods, and we're finding that different application methods can impact what we see. And so I want to point out, when we're doing tree fruit, we don't broadcast over the whole area. We do direct row application with a side manure spreader. And when we are doing this, rather than calculate tonnage per acre, which when we're talking about direct application, we're probably looking at 1.5 to 2 tons per applied acre, but we usually do it by volume. So we do a percentage. We calculate the volume of a 2-foot wide row by a 6-inch depth, which is where the nursery trees, about how deep those roots are gonna go. And then we would calculate what is replacing 10% of that soil look like, and that's the amount we apply. So we do percentage. So here's another example of us applying biochar. So This was a situation where we had planned to do this exact same method, but they'd already put the trees in the ground, but the top of the roots were still exposed. So we dropped biochar into the ditch and covered it up, and I'll get into the results of this application method in a bit. And then, of course, down here, here's field application. So this is Tabasco. So they dropped it over a big area, tilled it in, and then as the peppers come along and they go to plant the peppers, they mound the soil. So this biochar only really needs to be incorporated in the top couple inches to get the pepper roots. And here's two more very time-consuming methods. So this one is individual planting holes with biochar mixed with nutrients, and then put in the planting holes, watered in, and then the trees were planted. And here's another one where we've seen where we've put the biochar in water and then injected the liquid biochar into the soil after the trees were planted. Now, to do something like this, you need micronized biochar, or you're going to be clogging up your equipment all day long. Yes. All day, for reals. Okay, so now let's get into some of the data, some of the stuff I was showing you. So Cosmic Crisp is an up-and-coming apple developed at Washington State University. And so we had 3 people in Washington State putting in new orchards. So we have 3 Cosmic Crisp orchards we're working on right now, which is pretty cool. But we have our regular ag biochar, which is from wheat straw, and then we have our ag biochar plus, which is we put in a little bit of fly ash from a nearby paper mill because we're trying to incorporate their waste as well. So what we found is that just over the course of one growing season with these Cosmic Crisps, our ag biochar only increased the height of these tree leaders by 2%. But by adding a little bit of fly ash in, and as we know, fertilizing biochar before you put it in is usually a good thing. So we saw a 20% increase in most of the plants, but the ones where we did individual planting holes, pre-fertilized, pre-watered in, we saw a 35% increase in height in that first year. And the height of these trees is important because they are tying these fruit trees up to wires, and they want these trees to reach the top wire so that they don't have to do so much more maintenance over and over year after year. So getting those trees to the top wire as fast as possible is a good thing. And here's another one that we started a year before, and this is about 100 miles away, slightly different soil. But with our ag biochar, we saw an increase of 11 and 10% in height growth. And we saw even more growth increases with the plus biochar. So here's an example of some caliper measurements we were doing. So our control is the gray line, and then our wheat straw biochar is the blue line. But then, of course, when we have our fly ash in there, we see much bigger increases in caliper over time, and definitely so between August and October. And this is in Yakima, a time of extreme water stress. There was a point where there were fires, water was even turned off in this field. And our biochar plants are just charging on through that stress. And then we see something similar out at our Royal City site. From one growing season to the next, our control plants are not really increasing in caliper, but all of our biochar plants are increasing in caliper, which is kind of an amazing thing. They just keep growing with the biochar in the soil. And so here is this is our ditch experiment where biochar was essentially filled into the ditch over top some roots and then covered up. And this was at 5% and 15% biochar. And we saw an increase in height in both of these cases and a bit of an increase in caliper in both of these cases. So that method works too, and it was pretty easy. One of the other things we look at also, definitely soil health. And we look at multiple things, but I just have a couple examples on here for you from different sites. But here's our total carbon time lapse. And we see a reduce in carbon with some control stuff, and our biochar is a little bit higher here. But then over here, our cherry orchard site, we have quite an increase of total carbon, which that should be the case, right? We're putting carbon directly into the soil. And then, of course, we look at organic matter. Our organic matter is generally increased. Up here, I would say that this one dropped, but I think it started with, it did start with a very high amount of organic matter. And these trees were the ones that increased 35% in height over one season. And then, of course, over here in our ditch experiment, we also see a pretty good increase in organic matter just in one growing season. We also have been looking at CO2 respiration, and we look at other microbial activities. I'm hoping that we'll be getting into our own sequencing soon, because our company, we have a sequencer, and I cannot wait to get into sequencing microbes in these situations. But for now, the 96-hour carbon dioxide respiration time lapse tells us is a measure of how much living activity is in the soil, right? So we do see an increase into the late summer and into the fall with our biochar plants at both sites. So now I'm gonna switch gears a little bit to some greenhouse trials that we have going on, because we have a pretty good greenhouse in Cheney where we actually make the biochar. And so here's just some basic plants, because this is a pretty cool thing. I get to decide what we're experimenting on for the most part, and I like flowers, so here we go. So this is just basic potting mix, and here's our control flowers, 5% biochar, and no extra fertilizer input, just the biochar. And same over here with our dill herbs, and again, one of the things that I find all the time in the greenhouse is we typically get earlier flowering, and we definitely get more vegetative biomass with biochar, even without adding additional fertilizers. Here's a lettuce experiment we did. We have a couple different kinds of biochar in here. We've got our wheat straw biochar, biochar we've made from hops, and biochar from timber, and we get 120% increase with timber biochar in the biomass here. And all three of these had very different water storage capacities in the soil, which was another interesting thing. And next year I'm gonna have some water data for y'all, I promise. Here's some other vegetative plants, coleus, just 2.5% biochar. I thought lowering it, okay, yeah, let's lower the biochar, see if we still get some good results. And biochar that was pre-charged was just 20-20-20 NPK, and then biochar mixed 50-50 with compost. And we see improvements here. And then we get into our catnip, we see our improvements with biochar and NPK, but then when we added compost, it was problematic for the catnip, which is something that we have to know, right? We need to know if compost is gonna be, or whatever fertilizers we're adding in, are they gonna work every single time? Is this a recipe we can use over and over? And not always, but usually. We've also done some germination experiments. One thing, we don't wanna be putting biochar into someone's pea field and then they drop a bunch of peas down and then they don't germinate. That's a huge problem. So we're looking at biochar germination, this is pepper germination. And we see that with just the regular biochar, we had better germination over time and earlier germination, which is a pretty good result. But this is also, we've also found that charging the biochar and then adding it to potting mix and trying germination does reduce the germination in a lot of cases. So that's something else to keep in mind when you're considering if you're putting biochar into a field and whether or not you're gonna pre-charge it. Are they starting with small plants? Are they starting with seeds? You need to make sure those seeds are gonna germinate because they are not cheap, right? Okay, so with that, I'll wrap this up. And what I've hopefully shared with you today is that wheat straw biochar specifically can improve soil health indicators in one growing season, increasing carbon, organic matter, microbial activity, and of course, healthy soil is supposed to lower annual inputs. Our field application method can impact plant growth. Biochar can mitigate drought stress, especially in those late season times, August, when everything's on fire in Washington. A small amount of biochar can improve germination efficiency and pre-charging can improve efficacy of plant growth, and biochar will pretty much always increase vegetative growth without additional inputs. So I'm going to do a quick plug here. There is a biochar study tour being hosted by the International Biochar Initiative in Washington State, October 28th through 30th. They'll take you on a tour through biochar sites throughout the state and so you can look at other people's crops and see what other farmers are up to. All right, with that, take questions, comments, concerns.